What if AI imagines a world without these 20 major historical turning points ever happening? If the American Revolution hadn't succeeded, North America would have stayed under British rule for ages. The whole idea of democracy and written constitutions would not have spread as quickly around the world. And without the US as a major player, world history would have taken a completely different path. No Titanic disaster. If the Titanic hadn't gone down, we would have been stuck with those outdated maritime safety rules for much longer, and more disasters would have happened before anyone got their act together. Insurance world would look different, too. And culturally, we'd be missing one of the biggest tragedies of the 20th century. No, my heart will go on, no Leo and Kate on the bow. If the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. hadn't occurred, what if MLK hadn't been assassinated? The civil rights movement would have taken a completely different path. His leadership would have kept shaping racial justice efforts in America for decades. The way people viewed the civil rights movement might be different without the whole martyr effect of his death. If the Civil War hadn't happened, America would have stayed divided for who knows how long. Slavery would have stuck around, pushing back civil rights progress for decades. Big yikes. The North's big industrial boom after the war might not have happened, changing the whole economic landscape. If the Oklahoma City bombing hadn't occurred, America's approach to domestic terrorism might have developed quite differently. That heightened awareness of homegrown extremism would not have kicked in until much later. People's views on militia groups and anti-government sentiment could be totally different. If the Bay of Pigs invasion hadn't occurred, the US might have tried different tactics against communism. The whole Cuba situation would have played out differently. Maybe we could have even avoided the Cuban Missile Crisis. US-Cuba relations might have taken a different path, possibly without that long-standing embargo. If the 9/11 terrorist attacks hadn't occurred, American foreign policy would look completely different today. The whole war on terror that reshaped global politics probably wouldn't have happened. Politics in the US and many other countries would have gone in a completely different direction, without that intense focus on national security and terrorism. If the Manhattan Project hadn't developed the atomic bomb, World War II without the atomic bomb? That's a game changer. The war would have dragged on much longer, probably forcing a land invasion of Japan. Imagine how many more casualties there would have been. If the Cold War hadn't occurred, picture a world without the Cold War. Global alliances would look completely different today. All the nuclear tension and arms race that defined so much of the 20th century? Gone. The US and USSR could have actually worked together, potentially speeding up scientific and tech advancements. If the Hindenburg disaster hadn't occurred, people might have viewed air travel very differently. The era of passenger airships might have kept going, maybe even leading to some cool innovations in lighter than air travel. The dramatic public impact of the disaster, which pretty much killed the airship era, wouldn't have happened. If the women's suffrage movement hadn't succeeded, imagine if women still couldn't vote or own property. Crazy. The whole political landscape would be so different. Progress on gender equality in other areas like education, jobs, and property rights probably would have been moving at a glacial pace. If the Watergate scandal hadn't occurred, what if Watergate never happened? Nixon's legacy would be completely different. We'd probably remember him more for his foreign policy achievements. And people's trust in the government would have stayed much stronger, changing the whole cynical field that developed in politics afterward. If the Emancipation Proclamation hadn't been issued, think about this. If Lincoln hadn't issued the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery in America would have stuck around way longer. The Civil War would have dragged on and on without this move that weakened the Confederacy. And civil rights for African Americans' progress probably would have been at a snail's pace. If the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 hadn't occurred, the city would look completely different today. All those old Victorian buildings might still be standing, giving the city a totally different character. The massive rebuild that helped make San Francisco a major West Coast player would have happened much more gradually. If the Louisiana Purchase hadn't occurred, America's expansion westward would have been much slower and more contentious. The balance between free and slave states would have played out differently, maybe even changing when and how the Civil War happened. If the Great Chicago Fire hadn't happened, imagine Chicago without the Great Fire of 1871. The city would look extremely different today. All the innovative architecture and urban planning that came out of rebuilding might never have happened. The city would probably still have old Victorian buildings and infrastructure from the mid-1800s, giving it a completely different vibe. If the moon landing hadn't occurred, imagine a world where we never set foot on the moon. The Soviet Union was the one to do it. All those cool satellite and telecom advances might have been seriously delayed. America's representative as the top tech dog probably would have taken a hit. If the Great Depression hadn't occurred, picture this. The Roaring Twenties just keep on roaring. Without the Great Depression, we would have just kept on partying. No mass unemployment, no soup kitchens. The whole fabric of American society would have been completely different. JFK's potential second term. Just imagine if JFK had lived to serve a second term. The 60s would have been a whole different ballgame. Civil rights would have moved faster, and Vietnam? Who knows, we might have avoided that altogether. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.